Hello, my name is Catherine Farrell, and I'll be talking with you today about sovereign wealth funds and environmental policy, in particular in the context of Latin America, and transformative sovereign wealth funds focused on inspiring and incentivizing ecological economic production. So I start out with this photo, or this series of images. This is a Swiss clock that is in the Central Park of Bogota, in the National Park. And it was given to the city of Bogota by the Swiss people. And it worked. And we imagine when it was given to them in the 30s. It's been repaired several times, most recently in 2013. And as you can see by my Swiss watch, which is there below, it doesn't work now. So I mention this because I feel that one of the big challenges that we face in Latin America when we think about investment, we think about capital management, is this question of maintenance. And how do we assure good maintenance? Well, one of the ways that we assure good maintenance is by making sure that the design of the system is easy to maintain. And that design of the system being easy to maintain is one of the main focuses that I will have in this talk. So I will start out the talk touching on the question of what is capital and how does that relate to sovereign wealth funds. So Jeffrey Hodgson gives us a very nice definition of capital, which is that it's the how and not the what. And this how and not the what is going to be a point of focus throughout my talk. That capital is what gives us access to money. In the context of ecological economics, and in particular the flow fund theory of Jujutsu, which is going to be my focus in this talk, we can talk about capital being a stable stock of resources that make production possible, what he calls fund elements, that remain stable over the duration of a process in question. We can all imagine that a financial investment that doesn't leave the capital that it started with, invest in the initiation of the investment available at the end, has not been successful. So when we think about designing sovereign wealth funds, one of the first things we need to keep in mind is what's the purpose of the sovereign wealth fund and what is its design supposed to be. Here I'm reminded of the concept of garbage in, garbage out. If we don't make a good design, we're not going to have a good result. And in ecological economics, we have to be thinking about how sustainable development is possible. When we're talking about how sustainable development is possible, we're thinking about systems that are alive, that are living systems. And here we can identify that living systems are particular. They have certain characteristics. They have novelty. And to design and describe how they're going to work, we can talk about their sufficient conditions for functioning. Their how, not necessarily their what. And their how we can connect to their why. So the text of reference for this talk is a paper I developed in 2019 with a colleague from Germany, David Lupia. And we talk about the reasons why in ecological economics, incentives are more appropriate than controls. We talk about the standard reasons like efficiency, creativity, and also market leadership and the ability to control and direct market development. But in ecological economics, we can also talk about them being compatible with living system dynamics. They specify hows and not whats. And they also expect novelty. They're context related and they're also purpose oriented. So when we think about incentives and we think about flow fund theory and ecological economics, I'd like to suggest that flow fund theory can help you to design good sovereign wealth funds. And here we focus on the difference between appropriateness and compensation. So a zero-sum game or a fit-for-purpose game. In living system contexts, where we think about the living system being a value creator and capital facilitating economic production, we can situate capital using flow fund theory as part of a living economic process. And we do this through reference to what's referred to by Jujutsu as economic agent, or purpose of perspective. And this defines capital's role. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that, but before I do, I want to introduce a concept he uses to develop the idea of economic enchant. And that's the difference between endo and exosomatic social organization, which he talks about in relation to ants as a very social species and human beings. So if we think about ants, they have a morphological differentiation of roles, endosomatic, made of differences in their bodies. These are all three species of the same ant, or three of the same species of ant, but they have very different bodies because of their roles. In human systems, differentiation of roles is based on norms and institutions, and we define that through things like uniforms and certificates. So in that respect, when we think about the biology of human society and structuring that, we're thinking about institutions and norms, and in that respect, thinking also about things like public policy and the design of a sovereign wealth fund. The next concept that I want to introduce before we get into the question of application is the complexity of life and how this is related to flow fund theory. So life is complex, we know that. When we think about biological complexity, we need to keep in mind that it's relational. Here we have a picture of the Queen Colonna ant, which is an ant that's native to Colombia and lives in colonies in the ground. Here she is with her colony, but it's also a food source. And when she's taken out of her colony, she becomes part of a different complex system and even changes her gender. It's no longer she, but an it, because it's now a food object. You can think of another example, which is a human lung, a very, very simple organ, arguably the most simple in the whole body, but very important, as we have all learned recently. So the human lung requires a very complicated apparatus to produce it outside of the body. And that's because its function is related to its situation in a complex system where relationships with muscle, bone, and blood facilitate its functioning. It is not available to the mechanical lung. So when we think about these relational complexity, Georgescu Rosen helps us to put this into the context of ecological economic analysis. And he brings to our attention that when we are going about being alive, sorting things and doing the things that living systems do, we're always faced with a choice. What are we going to produce with an economic process? Is it going to be a Cadillac or is it going to be food? He argues that it's impossible for us to generate complete and sufficient representations of these processes using only mathematics, that we need to also consider the non-arithmetizable aspects of these processes. And to do that, he introduces the flow fund categories. Now, the flow fund categories are easy to understand if we think about them in terms of production process. Flows are inputs or outputs. They're either consumed or they're produced. They enter but do not leave, or leave without having entered. That means they were made. And funds are elements that remain stable over the duration of the process. David Lobier and I argue that capital can be understood as a flow, a fund, or a process fund, which is a special type of fund, depending on the way that we understand its relationship to the process in question. And that is defined by Georgescu Rosen with this concept of economic Anschauung that I mentioned. So economic Anschauung, to think through what that particularly means, we can take the example I developed with my colleague Jose Carlos Silvermacher of a cherry tree. So a cherry tree, is it capital or is it a product? Well, is it being produced or producing? Is it a flow or is it a fund? Well, to the farmer, it's a producer of fruit, so it's a fund. To the carpenter, however, it's a consumable that's used to make an output flow, which is the table. We can also think about this in terms of a bee that's consuming its nectar, so it's serving as a fund, or an aphid that uses it as a direct source of food. So now we have our concepts and our ideas of a flow fund theory and elements, and the way in which this helps us to think about the relationship between the purpose of an economic process and the actual way in which that economic process plays out. I'd like to move on from there into practical application, and for that, I'd like to bring some people to help me and think about whether or not we can use sovereign wealth funds to incentivize ecological economic production. So here, asking a few big heavy hitters in economics to come with us. What do these three people all have in common? They're all focused on quality-centered economics about life. Arguably, the person who opened this discussion was Schumpeter back in the 1920s and 30s, where he was working on the question of capitalism being dynamic. And that dynamism is intimately related to it being alive. Georgescu Rosen was a student of Schumpeter's, and he was very conscious of this work, and he moved on to talk about biological qualitative change being the actual purpose, the idea of economic processes, and again, bringing our attention to questions of novelty and dynamic change. And finally, we can think with Brennan, who brings us to the applied context of ecological economics and feminist economics, calling to our attention that biological life has a timing, that it's constrained by time, and that this is inconsistent with modern industrial timing. This is a theme that was present in a very explicit way in Jijiska Roshan's work and in an implicit way in Schumpeter's. So if we try to return to this question of focusing on the how and not just the what, we can begin to think about the difference between different designs of sovereign wealth funds. So a sovereign wealth fund can be developed and designed just as a speculative project, where capitalization is really the only thing going on. Maybe directed out of country, for example, to control exchange values, which is one of the main motivations. There, the market influence can run counter to transformative objectives of the country or of the countries where it's being invested. And the accumulation is basically focused on taking what has been generated in another context, not necessarily with an idea of the aims involved. So with a transformative sovereign wealth fund, where we think about conserving the integrity of the critical capital funds that are involved in the processes of making value, we can talk about in-country being focused towards capitalizing with a definite purpose. We can talk about out-of-country being designed to generate and stimulate certain types of development in economies. We can also talk about targeting for transformative economic trends. And those economic trends are related to this identification of what needs to be done in an ecological economic context. And finally, the accumulation is through life-affirming wealth creation, not just directly through appropriation. Finally, I'd like to go through an example of how I think we can take a new approach using a case that I expect you'll all be pretty familiar with, which is the Yasuni IT project. I refer to it as a groundbreaking fiasco with a lot of lessons. So it started out, we could argue, in 1999 with the project of Leave the Oil in the Soil, which was picked up by the government of Ecuador and presented to the world in 2007 in that famous speech from Rafael Correa. And then for 7 years, Ecuador and the rest of the world tried to pull it together and make it work. And at the end, it did not work. There was not funds. The target levels were not achieved. It was arguably for a lack of interest, but I would argue that it was for poor design. So it was an initiative, to change history, and I think it did. So it was about not exploiting a concession, and the configuration of the sale was designed to keep that in mind, which was innovative. So the payment was for the O2 production and the conservation of biodiversity associated with not exploiting. But there was no incentive to buy, because at the time, political policy and public policy was focused on questions of carbon sequestration. There was no transparency. So the fund was basically to subsidize Ecuador doing what it liked. Keeping in mind the flow fund theory and the ecological economics transformative sovereign wealth fund theory that I presented to you, we can talk about a leader for leader approach, where there's a public policy that says for every liter used, there has to be one left in the ground. This incentivizes the purchase. This can be linked, for example, to the Doha Agreement and would have a real market logic that supports biodiversity conservation. We need Doha mechanisms, and I think this could be one. It also could be expanded to private buyouts, and it includes built in these ideas of transparency. So as a last piece, I'd like to just show you a slide from the work that I did with David Lovier. I'm not going to be able to explain this in detail, but the key issue here is if you look at these two X's above, this type of approach allows us to begin identifying things such as the need to avoid carbon-based inputs for battery production in electric vehicles, and also to avoid energy production used through tropical hydropower. Always in each case, keeping in mind this question of how to conserve the critical capital funds, whether they're biological, ecological, or financial. Thank you for your attention.